And get started. So this is the Acquia Engage session on Cloud IDEs and managed tools. So our agenda for today, we're going to be discussing what a Cloud IDE is, the benefits of using a Cloud IDE, general concepts and features of a Cloud IDE, some use cases of the Cloud IDE, and Barrett will be walking through some demonstrations of some different workflows, and then we'll have some time for questions. So what I wanted to start with quick was a show of hands, or I think in the chat you can actually put a thumbs up or thumbs down. Who here has used a Cloud IDE before, either Acquia's Cloud IDE or another?
I'm looking for thumbs.
We have one thumbs down, no thumbs up yet.
I found it.
Okay, there we go. We got 2 thumbs up, 2 thumbs down. So that's good. So yeah, this will be a session where, it's kind of a baseline. We do expect that some people in this presentation may be brand new to Cloud IDEs. It's also, we will get into some technical concepts, but at the same time, if you are non-technical and you're just or how it may work for your team, or if it's something you could use, we will kind of cover that as well. So some quick introductions, and Barrett, I will let you introduce yourself here first.
I'm Barrett Smith. I'm a technical manager in our professional services department. I've been with Acquia for, I'm coming up on, I guess, 8 years now, and been in Drupal since the early days of Drupal 6.
Sounds good. And I am Scott Falconer. I've been with Acquia for about 5.5 years now. I've been working with Drupal for probably about 15 years at this point. I think I started right around 4.5 or 4.6. So I've seen some evolution in Drupal. And one of the things I'm really excited about this presentation is I think that Cloud IDEs are really one of these things that's going to smooth over one of the biggest pain points that we see with development. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I still run into all sorts of problems every single day with my development environment. So as we go through, feel free to post some questions in the chat, and then what we'll do at the end is we can refer back to those. Depending on what I see in the chat, I may clarify as I'm talking, or we'll have hopefully 10 or 15 minutes towards the end for some open questions. So a baseline, the Acquia Cloud IDE is a browser-based source code editor, an integrated development environment, and a Drupal development stack running on Acquia Cloud. So we'll kind of dig into some of the specifics of what this means, because as we've made that transition from what we would traditionally call local development to cloud development, some of those meanings and the ways that we refer to different parts of the system can often change or make you rethink what they specifically are. So some concepts and terminology. So integrated development environment. And this one is funny because I know what an IDE is, but I actually had to Google it for a good definition of it because I couldn't explain it. And the best one I saw was an integrated development environment is the software you use to write software, right? It is the tools and mechanisms you use to produce software every day. And so when I refer to integrated development environment, it is that collection of those tools. You'll hear me use the term local development and sometimes true local. And what I'm meaning there is an IDE, a code editor, a development stack that lives on your physical hardware directly in front of you. So on your laptop or the computer that is physically directly in front of you. Whereas a Cloud IDE is conceptually the same thing, except it's hosted somewhere that is not on your machine. So it's accessible effectively anywhere via a browser. When I use the term code base is the collection of code that makes your application. So in the context of Drupal, that is generally both the tools you may use to build your site, and then the code itself that runs, that you push up to your production environment. The code editor in the context of the Cloud IDE is where you're actually typing and changing the letters in the code that is in front of you. And then the workspace. And the workspace I use to mean the collection of everything in the development environment that is outside of the code editor itself. So it is the box that is running things like your database. It is executing the PHP. It is, in the case of a Cloud IDE, also hosting and running your code editor. That's where your version of PHP is installed. And that for Cloud IDEs was one of the biggest conceptual things to learn. The difference, because they are put together, of the code editor and the workspace itself that is executing what I'm doing. And then just because sometimes I know for newer users this can be confusing, we'll use the term Cloud IDE or your development environment to refer to where you're editing code, but you will also hear the term in the context of Acquia Cloud of your dev environment or your development environment and your test and production. And so what dev means there is the initial place where you stage up your site, the first place it's hosted on Acquia before you push it out to test and production. So I'll try to clarify that, because you end up with two development environments. You end up with your Cloud IDE development environment where you're actually doing development, and then a Acquia Cloud hosted development environment. And this is the same as the dev environment that's been around for many years. The first place where your code is staged up to the cloud. Any questions on this so far?
Yeah, I don't want to get anyone bogged down, but when you spin up the IDE, are you basically making a virtual machine that's separate from your dev instance, your cloud dev instance?
Yep, it is a completely standalone hosted infrastructure. So it is completely separate from your dev, test, or production hosting on that, and it is a machine that is purely for the pure development in front of you. It's the same as picking up a new laptop and setting up a dev environment there.
So you can when you commit to your branch and let's say you merge back to master, that would be on your dev, on your cloud dev. You could push to test and then push to prod.
Yep, and Barrett's demo towards the end of this, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for that. We'll go through exactly that topic. So
I'll try to.
No worries. This is great. So it's good for me to know. So some of the different features of the Cloud IDE. So the screenshot here is what you will see in your browser at baseline when you load up the Cloud IDE. And I have the same screenshot here with some specific instances. So you'll see the terminal. And the terminal here works for more or less exactly like the terminal on your local machine works. You can create directories. You can SSH into things. You can use and install most tools that you would install on your local machine. You can access the log. So when we say terminal there, it is very much just a terminal. The difference is that it is hosted, and that terminal lives on your hosted cloud workspace that you are interfacing with through the browser. So if you were to do, say, a command that showed the amount of disk space that you had or memory usage, it would actually show you what is actually on that cloud instance. Your code editor here, so you can browse and look through the different code you have, and on the right side of the screen, you can actually see where you can actually edit that code. You can move these windows around to your preference. You can open them in multiple windows if you need. I find that a lot of time in my environment, I will set up my terminal in one browser window and then my code editor in another, just so I have that kind of full screen environment. The other features of the Cloud IDE, the workspace specifically, so it comes out of the box with many installed tools, plugins, and a level of resources. So resources on a workspace, and this is per Cloud IDE workspace that you spin up, 4 gigs of memory, 2 CPUs, and 60 gigabytes of disk space. That is all connected internally within the Acquia network, which is really nice. So if you're doing something like pulling down a database or pulling all your files, it's going to be much faster than if you were pulling it down to your true local. And then tools and plugins. There's a huge list here, so I haven't listed them all, but your standard development tools like Git, Composer 1 and 2 in this instance. The Acquia command line interface, and I wanted to call this one out specifically, and Barrett will show some of this in his demo, but this is a command line tool provided by Acquia that handles many of the common tasks you will do in pulling your site down, deployments, things like that. And I will post towards the end of this the full list in the chat here so everyone can see it. So one of the reasons that we developed the Cloud IDE was because we saw across many clients common causes of pain when using local development. And I think probably anyone who's done any sort of development has run into this one way or another. Common things we saw were things like network or device administrative access, right? We've seen from times where a customer's company network may block things like GitHub. So if you try to install Drupal and it's pulling a lot of dependencies down via Composer and you can't access GitHub, you're going to get some errors, right? Local machine resources. You may have an older machine that an older machine, and then you're forced into a situation, potentially in an older machine, to run some sort of virtualization on top of that. So something like Docker, where you're using much more resources at that point, that gets to the point where your development is slowed down based on the constraints of your specific resources. Many times developers that come into Drupal, a lot of times from other sources that are new to open source tools and workflows. The new to open source tools one, we can see a lot where that becomes problematic for developers that we see using Windows, because a lot of the people that maintain the open source tools that we commonly use are not using Windows. So it's not always tested. That can be a point of concern. That leads to the differences in operating systems. At the same time, within organizations, we often see things like a blend of laptops that may be, or a blend of machines that are in the organization. There may be some Macs, there may be some Linux, there may be some Windows machines. All of those are an overhead and a point of concern. And then the updates and ongoing maintenance, right? I think a lot of times teams set out and they have their estimates and they have their plan for updating the product in hand. And what is forgotten is the overhead it takes to update the tooling they use, which often means that doesn't happen, right? So something like updating from Composer 1 to Composer 2, huge amount of benefits there, but it probably doesn't happen as often as it should, just because teams are very busy and don't have time to do that. So again, why you should use the Cloud IDE, and you'll see this in Barrett's demo, the reduced setup and maintenance. When you spin up Acquia's Cloud IDE, most of the common development dependencies that are used across our teams and internally are already installed and configured for you. And as new things comes out, those are updated and maintained for you. It is the parallel to years ago when most developers or most projects move from a server that you maintain to a managed server, and you don't have to worry about some of the baseline updates, right? You don't have to worry about things necessarily like a PHP update, where it changes it from you actually having to do the update and downloading and installing a new version of PHP to it is teed up for you, and you via configuration can switch that over. A development environment that is tuned to Drupal, right? So what is going to make your development environment work fast? What are some of the concerns when you're running something like Composer that may use a lot of memory or may use a lot of network bandwidth, and not having to deal with that in your specific situation? The network and system speed, and this is one of the funny ones. A lot of times when I'm introducing Cloud IDEs, the question I'll get from people is, what happens if I'm on an airplane? And it's always a kind of a funny one to me, because you are more likely nowadays to be in a situation where you are on a bad or slow connection versus no connection. And a Cloud IDE will almost generally work better for you in a slower degraded network environment than your local would be. So if you're pulling down a large amount of files, if you're pulling down a database that sometimes can be hundreds of megabytes, I know at the same time, I have a problem where I've been downloading files or doing some sort of update and I forget and I close my laptop lid and it doesn't happen. So that's one of the benefits there. Effectively an infinite number of machines. So within your Acquia account, you will have a set level of IDEs that can be used. What's nice is you can switch around between those. You could be using one IDE for a certain amount of development. You could spin up a secondary one and say, I want to do some other development here. This is really nice in the situation where you could, if you are, say, in an agency type setting or a setting where you're jumping around from many different customers at the same time, the overhead of spinning up, tearing down, spinning up, tearing down a machine can be hard, whereas now it's reduced to going to a different URL. The ability to use from nearly anywhere. I have been using IDEs for several years now. I know on my personal site, one time I was at my grandmother's house and I wanted to do something really quick because I had some downtime, and I was able to log in from her very old machine and do what I needed to do on the site because I needed my password, and that's effectively what I needed. Improved security. So there's not going to be a situation here where someone loses a laptop or leaves a laptop in their car and it gets stolen, and you have that, all the concerns about what data was on there. Did we have customer data on there? Where's the code? This is locked down and secure, just as your production code is on your Acquia environment. And then the shareability of the Drupal instance. So when I'm talking about shareability here, this is the ability to share a link to the site that you are working on. One of the common ones we see is a developer's working on something. they want to show, do a proof of concept, show a quick early demo to somebody, say, in a different department. If that's not up on your Acquia development or test environment, it can be hard to share that. Maybe you walk over to them and you show them the laptop in front of you, which is even harder now when we're all effectively working remote. What the Cloud IDE does allow you to do now is spin up a special link that will allow somebody to see the site that you are working on your Cloud IDE environment. And then some tips for using the Cloud IDE. For more or less, use the Cloud IDE like you would your true local. Most of your tools and workflows stay exactly the same. If you're doing something specific in how you deploy via Git or a branching strategy, more or less, you can use that in the same way. I do encourage use a code repository and commit often. Treat the Cloud IDE like a laptop that you could use, right? The same due diligence that you would have at any point. And that's just more of a precautionary measure to not change the same oversight and the backup and the saving of code that you would traditionally have. But at the same time, don't be constrained by how you've always done things, right? So I know in my case, and I've heard this very commonly, people will come into Cloud IDEs and then they'll spend a lot of time messing around trying to make it work how they have traditionally worked. And I did the same thing, and almost invariably, you come back to it's not worth maintaining. The parallel I see in this is... Can someone mute? Okay, sorry. Hold on a second while we find out who's... Are we good now? Is the echo gone? Awesome. Okay. One of the parallels I see in this is for a long time, I wanted to have my MP3s in my music player, right? I just wanted to own the MP3, so I know I'd have the album forever. And things like Spotify and the predecessors to Spotify came out, and I was like, I don't want that. I don't want to do a stream thing. I actually want to have the MP3s. Couple laptop moves, couple years of crash hard drives and stuff like that, and you realize it's just not worth living under that same paradigm that I've lived on, and now I'm happily within Spotify, right? And I see the same thing happen if people use the Cloud IDE. There are things that, you feel are important, processes you want to change, and then when you actually get into them and you're like, this isn't worth my time to maintain it, I'm going to do it in a new way because the Cloud IDE makes things easier, or I can think about them differently. Try out new tools. Lots of tools installed on the Cloud IDE that you can try out, and this allows you to try and think about new workflows. It's a good time to reevaluate the workflows you may use in your organization. And then this last one, the create, delete, create. One of the really nice things, and you can take risks in IDEs because you can spin up new ones. You can try it out. If you mess everything up, destroy it and start a new one over and over, right? I know on my personal laptop, sometimes I get very hesitant, especially if I'm outside of a container environment, to do things like update Python or update PHP because I don't want to break everything else. That concern is a bit mitigated because I know at any time I can just delete the IDE and make a new one and start over. And then get feedback, right? So this is a newer tool within Acquia, and the team that is maintaining it is very receptive to the feedback and the questions that customers have on how this is used. And so I know they're very happy to hear the use cases and the things that you run into and the things that you would like to see in the IDE. So with that, I think I'm going to hand off to Barrett now for the demo. Are you there, Barrett?
Yep, just trying to get my screen sharing working.
Okay,
second, please.
good. While we do that, any questions or thoughts on this first part? Okay, perfect.
Hi, Scott. This is Lisa.
Hi.
As part of the new tools, some of the challenges that I've ran into is just dealing with, I have my production website and I have a lot of different data that's going into my database, whether it's through the user interaction or somebody going into the content. And is there any tools that can take from the IDE or the cloud dev and do a comparison to the database between your production and your dev IDE or dev cloud environments?
So specifically to the data that is there?
Well, it would be a script of the structure and also the data, because obviously as you're making updates, whether you're doing, the Drupal core or you're doing modules or different changes, there's structure to the database that changes, or there's just data that might get added to the production database that aren't in your development environments at that time. So how do you sync back the changes to the database?
And that's a really common one. And that's where, so the workflow we traditionally use, we're pulling down from our upstream databases all the time. And what you want to make sure is that the changes you are making, right, are carried back to either update hook for your code or to the configuration that is then pushed up. So that's the mechanism. So if you find yourself in a situation where a developer, say, is working on their local environment and creating a view or a content type on their local and then recreating that on production, that's where it's worth looking into like the configuration management workflow that can encapsulate that into code to make sure the same thing happens over and over.
Great, thank you.
Awesome, cool. Okay, you good to go, Barrett?
Sorry, I need 1 more minute. Chrome crashed and took out all my windows.
Okay, good. Yep. Any other questions there then? Cool. Yeah, that one of the things on that pushing configuration upstream, like it's not hard. I mean, sorry, it's not easy a lot of times to start that new workflow, right? And this is where I do see a benefit in the Cloud IDEs, because some of the tools that you would use to effectively do that are going to be in place there. So the team, it's one of those things that constantly, like, I mean, to be honest, on my personal side, a lot of times I do it that exact same method. I change my stuff on dev and I change it on production because I work on the site once every 6 months and I don't have time to deal with it. But with the reduction in having to even maintain and spin up my personal environment, because I am using the Cloud IDE, I can spend some time focusing on that a bit more. So.
Yeah, great suggestions. Thank you.
Cool, and I'd love to hear, and Barrett, okay, there you are. Cool, you good to go, Barrett?
I am getting some other things set up. I can go ahead and start, or if there are other questions, we can field those.
Yeah, let's do a couple more questions. I'd love to hear if there are no specific questions. Has anybody on the call used the Cloud IDE yet? And do you have any feedback? What are your thoughts so far? Any questions you may have in using it?
I'm personally looking forward to it. I have not yet had a chance to take advantage of it because we were using Dev Desktop.
Okay, cool.
Unfortunately, we ran into some problems, like you're talking about with the local environment where in permissions. And so for some reason, certain directories would get changed. And then of course I throw, move everything up to the Dev Cloud and I go to render the website and view it. And of course it's completely the style sheets. Everything's like mismatched and just not looking well. And you guys have a magic script you always run. So I'm looking forward to the IDE taking care of getting rid of those, roadblocks for us and obstacles we have to work around.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I have a quick question as well. Could the Cloud IDE conceivably be used for projects outside of Acquia? So could you pull an external Git repo and push to a different remote?
Yes. And this is one that you can more or less effectively do anything you would do on your local here. I've played around with it. I know it's not something that the team directly supports now, but we did some experimenting working with Python, pulling down some other external repositories and integrating with that. It definitely works. I wouldn't say it's supported necessarily, but yes, absolutely.
What's the licensing tie into Acquia? Is it on a user basis or is it on a project or plan basis?
So I'm probably the wrong person to answer that accurately, but the baseline. So usually it's tied to a number of IDEs on a kind of account project level from what I've seen so far. So they are tied to your specific account.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. So you could conceivably, if you have multiple projects in a solution, use a single IDE across all of them.
You could, but this is where I do encourage, and this is like rethinking your workflows, using a separate IDE for the separate projects. One, because then you don't have to worry about it. Like once they're spun up, they are just at different URLs, right? And if you have one Acquia account that has multiple subscriptions on it, you can easily bounce between those without having to log in. From a a code sanity standpoint for keeping data separate, like just using the separate IDEs is nice because you don't worry about that crossover.
Okay, but you can have multiple across projects with one IDE subscription, or do you need a lot?
Yes, so it is. I think 5 is kind of the baseline number. So each, and again, like there's probably someone that can answer this question specifically better than me, but each account will have, or on your subscription, multiple IDEs, and that number is flexible and can change, right? So we could theoretically see a situation where someone may say, on this project, I have 20 developers and I want 20 specific IDEs. We could see a situation where someone says, I have 10 developers, but each of them needs 2 for different use cases that they want within this project, so we still want 20. That flexibility is there to kind of bounce around.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Okay, Scott, I think I'm ready whenever.
Cool. Yep.
There are no more questions.
Yep.
So, Scott's been talking through the details of what Cloud IDE is, why you might use them, and here we're gonna talk about really the meat and potatoes of how you use them, where the rubber hits the road, and talk through some of the workflows and use cases involved there. So there are 2 general approaches that we want to talk about when we come to repository management that get into how you use Cloud IDEs. Those are really the question of, do you commit your dependencies? So all the composer libraries that are pulled into your project, or do you not commit those? There are valid use cases for each, and this seems to be one of those questions that is probably going to become a persistent developer fight as to which is right. But there are cases when both are appropriate. So the first approach, committing your dependencies, is the one that that first Acquia Cloud itself requires. And that if you've seen the previous Cloud IDE demos, you'll have seen the setup and linking the Cloud IDE to your Acquia Cloud account using that kind of committing of dependencies. So it's a direct interface and direct code exchange between the Cloud IDE environment and the Acquia Git repository. The advantage of this approach is that it's a simpler overall technical approach. And for deployments in cases, it can be a faster mechanism of doing things. The downside, or potential downside, is that it means the repository that you're working with is larger, because it has to contain all those vendor libraries. It also means that there's a chance that if you don't have good development practices, your composer file can get out of sync with what's actually committed to your code base and create confusion down the line. For those of you who worked with Drupal 7, for instance, we commonly used drush make files to manage dependencies in Drupal 7. And we often saw this being a problem where we'd have module versions that were defined in our drush make file, but developers would download that module directly and update it directly in the code base. And so what you had in your make file didn't match what you had actually in the code base. The approach that PS most commonly takes is using two repositories and not committing dependencies to our source repository. So in this workflow, instead of pushing and pulling code to the Acquia or to the Cloud IDE from your Acquia Git repository, you'd be pushing and pulling code between the Cloud IDE and usually GitHub, though it could also be Bitbucket or any, even a self-hosted really Git repository. That repository then becomes what we refer to as your source artifact, or sorry, your source repository. So your developers are working in that repository on a day-to-day basis. The dependencies are not committed to that repository. And then when you're ready to do a deployment, you use a CI process like pipelines, or could use Jenkins or Travis, or you can even run BLT deploy to pull in all your composer files, create a build artifact, which includes your dependencies, and committing that into Acquia's cloud repository, Acquia's Git repository. The advantage here is that you don't have that risk of composer and what's in your code base actually getting out of sync. And once you've involved a CI process, it really opens the door for a lot more technical complexity, technical steps you could do, like building in automated testing as a pass condition before code actually gets deployed. Obviously, the disadvantage here is that it increases the technical complexity of your system and of doing those deployments. Somebody has to know pipelines or know Jenkins and be able to write them in the first place and manage those files as you go forward in order to kind of facilitate this approach. So since the two repository approach is what PS, professional services, uses, but it's not generally, the demo that we usually do for Cloud IDE doesn't show that. I wanted to take a minute to talk through how you would set up that two repository approach in Cloud IDE. So we'll talk through the steps involved, and then I'll pull up my Cloud IDE demo environment, and I can actually show you what those steps are. So the first step, if you guys have seen the Cloud IDE demo so far or worked with Cloud IDE already, you'll be familiar with this, the screen shown here. The first step is the same as you do through the normal UI process for setting it up. You're just going to click the Configure IDE button. That's going to prompt you for an API key for your Acquia account. It'll create an SSH key. It'll push that SSH key and associate it with your Acquia Cloud account to enable that communication. Where things get different is in the second step. In the standard process, we would click that copy from Acquia Cloud button, and it would walk us through, selecting the environment that we want to pair it with, and pull down code, files, and database from that Acquia Cloud environment. But in this case, we don't want to do that. We want to set it up to pull code from GitHub. So we need to take the SSH key that was created in our first configuration step, copy it, and add it to our GitHub account. We need to set our email and name for git config so that when we're doing development and making commits in this Cloud IDE environment, it has the right info to attribute that authorship to. Then we'll clone the repo from GitHub, into the Cloud IDE. And finally, we'll run the ACLI refresh command to pull down just the database from Acquia Cloud to our Cloud IDE environment. And I should clarify, it's not just the database, it's the database and the files. We're not pulling down the code from Acquia Cloud. So, as always, live demos go sideways. I hope I have my fingers crossed that all this is going to go as expected. But if things go sideways, bear with me for a second and we'll get it back on track. So I have my Cloud IDE go. Okay, so this is my Acquia Cloud subscription. This is a dev environment that we're going to use as our test sandbox. And I need to open up Cloud IDE. And it's prompting me to log in again. Two-factor authentication. Both my favorite and least favorite invention of the last 20 years. Okay. So, like we talked about, for starters, I'm going to hit that configure IDE. And let me blow this up so it's a little easier to read on the screen. Now, to set up the relationship between my Acquia account and my Cloud IDE, I need to have set my API or set up an API key in Acquia Cloud. That I'll supply here. So it's going to save credentials and start the process of creating an SSH key and uploading it to Cloud. While it's doing that, I'll go ahead and open up my GitHub account here. As you can see in my Cloud account, or sorry, in my Cloud IDE, it's created this this new SSH key that matches this long hash associated with my IDE environment. So I've got that. Copy it and just add it into my all right. Now I'll do this at the git config. All right. Now, the next step from our list is to clone my GitHub repo. Let me So I've already set up my repo here. Now, one of the traditional way of doing this would be to copy this SSH ID for the repo and run, from my Cloud IDE, do a git clone. But GitHub has this nice new CLI that we also bake into the Cloud IDE environments. So for this case, I actually want to use that to do my clone. Okay. Now, at this point, I should be able to open my Drupal site and see the code. But something's going wrong. And the reason something's going wrong is because if you look at where I am in the site, I'm under Home IDE project, my repo name, and then under that repo is the doc root. But the Cloud IDE expects to find my doc root directly under the project repo. So I did this on purpose because it's one of the things that as you start using Cloud IDE, you'll stumble over a time or two before you get in the habit of cloning into the right location. So what I need to do is remove that whole directory, rerun my GitHub command, and tell it to clone directly into my project environment. Okay. Our composer is doing its installation. We can go back and look at the site again, but you'll notice it still seems to think there's something wrong. There's actually not. It's just that when you don't have code in the first place, it's going to redirect you to this welcome index.html. And so if you've opened the cloud site before the code's in the right place, you can end up stuck here until you realize that. But now that I've got my code in the right place, you can see it's recognizing that I've got Drupal, and it's prompting me to do the setup since I haven't pulled my database down yet. So I'm going to do a CLI refresh. This is using that ACLI Acquia command line interface tool that Scott was referencing earlier. But I'm going to use no code because all I want to pull is the database and file system. So it's recognizing it's going to allow me to pull from either dev or stage. We deliberately don't give you the option to pull from production because the process of running a database dump from your production environment can be resource intensive. If you've got production traffic hitting it and you're doing a database dump at the same time, it can cause problems. So we only allow you to pull from dev or stage. In my case, I want to pull from stage and here, from dev. And here you can see I've got two databases set up in that environment. So it's asking me which one I want. And it's going to do a MySQL dump and then load that into the Drupal environment locally. And we'll just let it work and come back to it in a second.
Barrett, question.
Yes.
In terms of getting your production database then to a stage, is it just recommend to just go into the cloud, the Acquia cloud, and to just do the move from production to stage there?
Yep. So what you do is in your, where did my cloud environment go? I obviously don't have it open, but yes, in your cloud environment, you would just, drag the database from production down to the stage or dev environment, whichever you wanted to pull from.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on?
Yeah, would you still be able to get your production environment database down using a dash command?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Would you still be able to get your production database down using a drush command instead of the CLI?
Yes, you should be able to. I haven't tried it personally, but you should be able to run like a drush SQL sync from the from production down to the IDE environment.
Yeah,
I imagine. Scott, have you tried that?
Yeah, it works. I mean, more or less anything you could do on the command line. So even if you wanted to like pull down via drush from some other remote site, like you could do that, right? There's nothing that's really going to prevent you from using drush as drush works. You just may need to set it up the first time.
Good to know. Thank you.
Okay. So now that we've talked through the environment, obviously from here, if I was a developer, I could just, I could open up my Cloud IDE, start writing code just like I would on any other project. But let's talk instead about the code review and debugging process. So Cloud IDE builds in a few things to make debugging and code review easier. One of them is the CLI Share command that Scott referenced earlier. As we said, IDEs are explicitly tied to your individual account. So once you've set it up, they're not generally accessible by other people. However, you can run that share command, get a URL that includes it's a relatively long hash, basically, that allows any user who has that hash to access the Drupal site associated with that Cloud IDE. So it'll allow you to share the Drupal site, but the IDE environment itself is still private to you. That makes it a lot easier to do things like, show a client what a feature you're working on looks like before you've completed a pull request and pushed it up. Also makes it really easy to show other developers what the environment looks like, so you can get input as you're going through. Whereas with a true local environment, you have to use some kind of tunneled approach to be able to make that available to the public. As I talked about a second ago, we also include GitHub CLI. You saw me use the repo clone feature to copy the code repository down. But one of my favorite commands, especially when I'm doing code reviews, is the PR checkout command. That makes it real easy to pull down the code that's in a pull request from another developer that they've opened on GitHub. And finally, Xdebug itself is set up and available in the Cloud IDE. If you're not familiar with Xdebug, it's probably one of the best PHP debugging tools available. It's also usually a nightmare to try to set up and get running. So shames me a little bit to say it, but most of the time when I'm doing debugging, I'll just throw a bunch of print statements or or logger statements into my code rather than spending the upfront time to try to set up Xdebug. So having Xdebug set up for us kind of automatically in Cloud IDE can be a huge time saver. So let's take a look at those processes. Let's see, my database has finished rebuilding. So I should now have a fully live site. Voila, my Cloud IDE site. And here's my dev site. So to prevent me from getting confused, I'm just going to close out my dev site. So one of the first things shows that CLI Share. So if I open up a new window where I'm anonymous and just try to access that URL, it's going to put me back through the Acquia Cloud login process. So I couldn't just share that bare URL with somebody I wanted to show the environment to. But if I run CLI IDE Share, and I copy this URL out. Oops. Oh, good grief. In an anonymous window, the presence of that share parameter in that hash makes the site available. Notice as those users navigate through, that hash goes away and just gets stored as a cookie, which serves the same process. All right, so talking about pull requests and code review, let's consider a scenario. I have on my site, should be probably familiar with the Umami distribution already. It's the Acquia Drupal demo distribution that comes with core. It's all geared around recipes. And so in a recipe site, we can look at a recipe and we see breakdowns for preparation time, cooking, cooking time, etc. So as a scenario, consider that we have a project working on this site, and one of the things we want to add is a display of the cost for each recipe. What's it going to cost you in terms of the ingredients to be able to prepare that? So I've turned a developer loose on that, and they've opened up a pull request in my Cloud IDE, in my GitHub repo. And it's pull request number 1. There obviously, you can see from the X here that there's a build process failure. So they're having some problems with it functionally. But as a say a technical architect or someone who's overseeing the project, I want to do code review and look at the feature itself to see where it is. So in my Cloud IDE, I'm going to do GitHub PR checkout. And the number of the PR. And it switched me to the branch in question. Just as update, I should run composer install, and I'll need to do a config import. See, we got problems with config import. So let's see what their problem is here. So it looks like one of the things they didn't do is install the module. Obviously, that's going to help. But if I go back and look at content, oops. I forgot to clear my caches. Now, what I'm expecting from this feature is that for the moment, it should take the list of ingredients and display out a cost aspect, down here next to these